The courtroom was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, like everyone's holding their breath without realizing it. Sunlight cut through the tall windows, throwing sharp lines across worn wooden benches and the polished rail that separated the public from the legal players. It was just another Tuesday in the county courthouse, the kind of place where most cases came and went without anyone outside the room ever noticing. But today would be different. At the defense table sat a young man in a simple navy suit. It wasn't expensive. No fancy stitching, no designer label, but it was clean, pressed, and worn with quiet confidence. He adjusted his glasses, glanced at his notes, and took a slow breath. He wasn't nervous exactly, more like focused. Like someone who knew exactly what was at stake, even if no one else in the room did. The bailiff called the case. The judge entered, a man in his late 60s with silver hair, a stiff collar, and a reputation for running a tight courtroom. He'd been on the bench for over 30 years, and over time that experience had hardened into something close to impatience. He scanned the room, then his eyes landed on the young man at the defense table. "Is the defendant present?" the judge asked, voice dry. The young man stood. "Your Honor, I'm counsel for the plaintiff in this matter." There was a pause. Not long, maybe half a second, but it stretched in the silence. The judge's eyebrows lifted slightly. He looked the man up and down, taking in the modest suit, the lack of a flashy briefcase, the calm but unassuming posture. "Counsel," the judge repeated, a hint of disbelief in his tone. "You're representing the plaintiff?" "Yes, sir." The judge leaned back, a small, almost imperceptible smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "And you're licensed to practice in this state?" The question hung in the air, sharper than it needed to be. A few people in the gallery shifted. The opposing attorney, a man in a tailored suit with a practiced courtroom swagger, glanced over with mild amusement. The young man didn't flinch. "Yes, Your Honor. I've submitted my credentials to the clerk's office along with a motion to appear pro hac vice, which was granted last week." The judge waved a hand as if swatting away a fly. All right. Let's not waste time with formalities. If you say you're an attorney, we'll take your word for it." There was a pause. Then he added, just loud enough for the front rows to hear, "Though I've seen plenty show up in court thinking a Netflix documentary qualifies them to argue law." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the room. The young man didn't smile. He simply nodded, sat back down, and opened his file. What the judge didn't know, and what no one in that room could have guessed, was that this unimpressive young man wasn't who he seemed. Not exactly. He wasn't pretending to be someone else, not in the way people usually think of deception, but he was stepping into shoes that weren't entirely his own. And he was doing it for a reason far deeper than pride or performance. Weeks earlier, his identical twin brother, the real name on the case filing, had received a threat. Not a vague, throwaway comment, but something specific, chilling, and tied directly to the lawsuit they were preparing. It involved a powerful local company accused of contaminating a neighborhood's water supply, and the kind of people behind it didn't like being challenged. Especially not by someone who looked like them. His brother had been advised to lay low, at least until the hearing was over. But the case couldn't wait. Lives were on the line. Families with sick children, elderly residents on fixed incomes, people who'd been ignored for too long. So the two of them made a decision, one that required trust, precision, and nerves of steel. He wasn't lying to the court. Technically, he was authorized to appear under emergency provisions, rare but legal. His brother had filed the proper paperwork, but no one had told the judge. And honestly, even if they had, the skepticism might have been the same, because sometimes, no matter how qualified you are, people see what they expect to see, and nothing more. Back in the courtroom, the opposing attorney stood to make his opening statement. He spoke smoothly, confidently, weaving a story that painted the plaintiffs as opportunists, exaggerating minor issues for a payout. He used big words, cited obscure regulations, and flashed graphs that looked impressive but meant little. The judge nodded along, clearly comfortable with this version of the world, the one where everything had a price, and justice was just another negotiation. Then it was the young man's turn. He stood again, slower this time. Not for effect, but because he wanted every word to land exactly right. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't gesture dramatically. He just spoke, clear, plain English, the kind anyone in that room could understand. "This case isn't about money," he began. It's about a child who can't breathe without an inhaler. It's about a grandmother who stopped drinking tap water 2 years ago because it smelled like chemicals. It's about test results that were buried, meetings that never happened, and promises that were broken before they were even made. He paused. The room was utterly still. The law doesn't require us to prove malice. It only asks one question. Did they know? And the answer is yes. They knew, and they chose to do nothing. He walked to the evidence table and picked up a single sheet of paper, a lab report dated 18 months earlier, stamped internal use only. He held it up. This was never shared with the community. It shows toxin levels 3 times above the legal limit, and it was signed off by someone in the defendant's own environmental compliance department. The opposing attorney started to object, but the judge held up a hand. He was watching the young man closely now, his earlier smirk gone. "How did you get that?" the judge asked. "Public records request," the young man replied. "Took 6 months and 3 appeals. But it's real, and it's theirs." Something shifted in the room. It wasn't just the evidence, it was the way he presented it. No theatrics, no anger. Just facts, laid out with care like pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into place. The judge sat back, fingers steepled. For the first time, he looked uncertain. Not about the law, but about his first impression. The rest of the morning unfolded like a slow tide turning. The young man answered every question with precision. When the opposing side tried to confuse the timeline, he pulled out a color-coded chart that made the sequence undeniable. When they claimed the health issues were unrelated, he introduced sworn affidavits from 3 independent doctors. He never raised his voice, never showed frustration, just kept building his case brick by careful brick. By lunch recess, the gallery was fuller than it had been all week. People who'd come for traffic violations stayed to watch. Court staff lingered in the hallway, whispering. And the judge? He didn't say much. But when court resumed, his tone was different. Sharper, yes, but also more respectful. He stopped interrupting. He started listening. No one knew the full story yet. Not about the threat, not about the twin, not about the years this young man had stepped away from the law after a personal loss that nearly broke him. But they were starting to see something else. Competence. Integrity. A quiet kind of courage that didn't need a spotlight to be real. As the gavel came down to end the day's session, the young man gathered his papers, nodded politely to the clerk, and walked out, not with swagger, but with the steady stride of someone who'd done what he came to do. Outside, the sun was lower in the sky. He took a deep breath, looked up, and allowed himself a small, private smile. The hardest part was over, but the real test? That was still coming. Rain tapped softly against the window of a small apartment tucked above a corner bookstore. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old paper and coffee. 2 identical faces sat across from each other at a kitchen table covered in legal files, highlighters, and half-empty mugs. One looked exhausted but alert. The other looked like he hadn't slept in days. They didn't need to speak much. They never had. Growing up, they'd developed a kind of silent understanding, finishing each other's sentences, knowing when the other needed space, sensing trouble before it arrived. That bond had carried them through school, through loss, through choices that pulled them in different directions. And now, it was the only thing holding this risky plan together. The brother who'd just come back from court, the one who'd stood before the skeptical judge, rubbed his temples. "He almost threw me out," he said quietly. "Not because I did anything wrong, just because I didn't look like what he expected." The other brother nodded slowly. "That's why I asked you to do this. Not just because of the threat, but because they'll never see you coming. To them you're invisible, and that's your advantage." It wasn't said with bitterness, just truth. The kind you learn early when the world keeps underestimating you. Years ago, both of them had graduated top of their law school class. Same GPA, same honors. But while one dove straight into civil rights litigation, taking on police misconduct cases, environmental injustice, housing discrimination, the other stepped away. Not because he lacked talent, but because life had dealt a blow that left him hollow. Their younger sister, the bright, laughing heart of their family, had passed suddenly from an illness tied to poor air quality in their old neighborhood. The grief was too heavy to carry while fighting battles in courtrooms. So he walked away, took a job teaching legal basics at a community college, and tried to rebuild something quieter. But he never stopped reading case law, never stopped following his brother's work. And when the call came, when his brother's voice was tight with fear after a note was slipped under his office door that read, "Drop the case or disappear," he didn't hesitate. "Can't let them win," his brother had said that night, standing in the rain outside his locked office. "These people, they've been poisoned for years. Kids are getting sick, and no one's listening." So they made a plan. A rare legal loophole allowed a licensed attorney to temporarily appear in court on behalf of another under extraordinary circumstances, especially if the original counsel faced credible danger. It wasn't common, but it was valid. They filed the paperwork quietly. The court approved it. No fanfare, no headlines. But stepping back into a courtroom after years away, that was like riding a bike you hadn't touched since childhood, except the bike was on fire, and the road was full of potholes. Still, he'd done it. And more than that, he'd held his ground. Now back in the apartment, the brother who'd stayed in the public eye pulled out a thick folder. "You were brilliant today," he said, "but tomorrow's when they'll come at you hard. They'll try to rattle you with procedure, with objections, with delays. They'll act like you don't belong." "I know," the other replied, "but I've been prepping for weeks. I've read every deposition, every email, every internal memo they tried to bury. I know their playbook." He opened his own notebook. Pages filled with neat handwriting, timelines, questions marked with stars, weaknesses in the opposition's case circled in red. He'd spent nights cross-referencing water test dates with delivery logs, matching employee shift schedules to when complaints were filed. It wasn't flashy work. It was the kind of work no one sees, but it's what wins cases. His brother smiled faintly. "You always did see patterns no one else noticed." They talked late into the night, rehearsing possible scenarios. What if the judge demands proof of standing? What if they introduce a surprise witness? What if they try to move the case to federal court to stall? For every what if, they had an answer. Not because they were showy lawyers, but because they cared deeply about the people behind the case file. The single mom who couldn't afford bottled water, the retired teacher who'd lost her garden to contaminated soil, the teenager who'd developed a rare skin condition no doctor could explain. This wasn't about fame. It wasn't about winning an argument. It was about making sure someone finally said, "This isn't right." The next morning before dawn, the brother who'd returned to the courtroom sat alone on the fire escape, sipping black coffee. The city was still quiet. He thought about his sister. About how she used to collect rainwater in jars just to prove it wasn't clean. About how she'd write letters to city officials that were never answered. He'd promised her once that he'd make things fair. He hadn't known how, but maybe this was his chance. Back inside, his brother handed him a fresh tie, dark blue, simple, the same one he'd worn the day before. "Consistency," he said. "Let them think you're the same unassuming guy. Let them keep underestimating you." At the courthouse, the buzz had grown. Word had spread about the mystery lawyer who dismantled the opposition's opening with calm precision. Reporters lingered near the entrance, though no one had given them a name. Courtroom 3 was nearly full by 9 a.m., not with lawyers, but with locals from the affected neighborhood. They came not for drama, but for hope. When he walked in, heads turned. Not with suspicion this time, but with quiet curiosity. Even the bailiff gave him a respectful nod. The judge entered a few minutes later. His expression was unreadable, but he didn't make any snide remarks. He simply said, "Proceed." The opposing attorney stood immediately. "Your Honor, before we continue, we'd like to formally challenge the standing of plaintiff's counsel. We have reason to believe there may be irregularities in his authorization to appear in this matter." A murmur went through the room. The young man didn't panic. He'd expected this. He stood, placed a single document on the clerk's desk, and said, "Your Honor, Exhibit A is a certified copy of the emergency appearance order granted by the State Bar on October 3rd, along with notarized affidavits from 2 supervising attorneys confirming my eligibility. I'm happy to provide additional documentation if needed." The judge scanned the papers. His lips tightened slightly. Then he looked up. "Motion denied. Counsel is properly admitted. Let's move forward." The opposing attorney sat down, jaw clenched. What followed was a masterclass in quiet determination. When they tried to drown him in legal jargon, he translated it into plain English for the judge, and for the people in the back row who deserved to understand. When they claimed records were lost, He produced backup copies from public archives. When they argued the health issues were coincidental, he played a voicemail from a former company employee who'd been told to stop asking questions after reporting unsafe practices. With every exchange, the courtroom grew quieter, not out of boredom but out of respect. By midday, even the judge was leaning forward, asking sharp, thoughtful questions. He wasn't smiling, but the condescension was gone. In its place was something rarer, genuine attention. During the lunch break, an elderly woman from the neighborhood approached the young man. She didn't say much, just placed a small wrapped cookie in his hand and whispered, "My grandson drinks bottled water now because of you. Thank you." He held that cookie like it was gold. Back in the apartment that evening, the brothers sat in silence again. No celebration, no grand speeches. Just two men who knew the fight wasn't over, but who also knew they'd turned a corner. Outside, the rain had stopped. Somewhere in the distance, a child laughed. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like justice wasn't just a word in a textbook. It was something real, something alive, something worth stepping back into the light for. The third day in court began like a calm before a storm. The air inside the courtroom felt different, charged like the moment just before lightning strikes. People filed in quietly, some clutching notebooks, others holding hands with neighbors. Word had spread beyond the local news. Something real was happening here. Not just legal maneuvering, but a reckoning. At the plaintiff's table, the young man in the navy suit adjusted his papers with steady hands. He hadn't slept much, but he didn't need to. His mind was clear, focused like a lens finally brought into sharp view. He knew today would be the turning point. Either the truth would break through, or it would get buried under layers of denial and legal tricks. The opposing side had changed tactics overnight. Gone was the smug confidence. In its place was a sharper, more aggressive strategy. They'd brought in a new witness, a former city inspector who'd supposedly overseen water quality tests in the affected neighborhood. On paper, he was credible, 20 years on the job. Clean record, soft voice that sounded trustworthy. But the young man had read between the lines long before the man ever stepped into the courtroom. When the witness took the stand, he spoke smoothly, said the water had always met safety standards, claimed any health issues were likely due to lifestyle factors or pre-existing conditions. He even smiled gently when asked about children getting sick, as if offering sympathy while quietly dismissing their pain. The judge nodded along, scribbling notes. The opposing attorney looked satisfied. Then it was the young man's turn to cross-examine. He stood slowly, walked to the center of the courtroom and asked just one question. "Sir, did you personally collect the water samples from Maple Street between March and August of last year?" The witness hesitated just a fraction of a second, but enough. "I reviewed the reports," he said carefully. "But did you collect them yourself?" "No, that was handled by field technicians." "Right," the young man said, voice calm. "And those field technicians, were they employed by the city or by CleanFlow Industries, the company you were supposedly overseeing?" A ripple went through the room. CleanFlow was the defendant, the corporation accused of dumping chemical waste into the groundwater for years. The witness shifted in his seat. I believe they were contracted through a third party. Actually," the young man said, pulling a document from his file, according to payroll records filed with the state. Those field technicians were on CleanFlow's direct payroll. They reported to a CleanFlow manager, and their test results were sent straight to CleanFlow's legal department before ever reaching your office. He paused. "So you never saw the raw data? You just signed off on reports written by the very company you were supposed to be regulating?" The witness opened his mouth, then closed it. His face flushed. The judge leaned forward. "Is this true?" The witness mumbled something about standard procedure and budget constraints, but the damage was done. The illusion of neutrality had cracked wide open, but the young man wasn't finished. He turned to the clerk. "May I approach with Exhibit 12? Permission granted. He handed the witness a single email, printed, highlighted, dated 6 months earlier. It was from a CleanFlow executive to the company's legal team. The subject line read, "Inspector Cooper, keep him happy." The body of the email mentioned a consulting fee of $15,000 paid through a shell company shortly after the inspector approved a key compliance report. The courtroom went dead silent. The witness stared at the paper like it might burn him. I don't know anything about this. You signed the report 2 days after that payment cleared, the young man said gently. And your daughter started at private school the following week. He didn't say it accusingly, just stated it like reading the weather, but everyone heard the weight behind it. The judge's pen stopped moving. His eyes narrowed. He turned to the opposing attorney. Counsel, care to explain? The attorney stood quickly. Your Honor, this is hearsay, unverified. We've never seen this email before. Funny, the young man said. Because it came from your client's own server, released under a public records request last month. Page 47 of the discovery packet if you'd like to check. The attorney sat down, jaw tight. What happened next surprised everyone. The witness, still on the stand, suddenly slumped. His voice dropped low. I didn't think it would hurt anyone, he said almost to himself. They said it was just paperwork. That the levels were within acceptable variance. I needed the money. My wife was sick. He didn't finish. But he didn't need to. The truth had spilled out, not in a dramatic confession, but in a quiet moment of human weakness. And in that moment, the whole case shifted. The judge called a 10-minute recess. As people filed out, murmurs filled the hallway. Some were angry. Others looked heartbroken. A few just stood in silence, staring at the floor. Back at the table, the young man took a deep breath. He hadn't wanted to destroy the witness. He'd only wanted the facts to surface. But justice wasn't clean. It was messy, tangled with fear, money, and hard choices. When court resumed, the judge didn't waste time. Plaintiff's counsel, he said. You may continue. The young man nodded. He didn't gloat, didn't smirk. He simply moved to his next point. He called a surprise witness of his own, an environmental scientist who'd worked for CleanFlow until she blew the whistle. She'd been fired, blacklisted, and forced to move cities. But she'd kept copies of internal memos, lab results, even voice recordings of meetings where executives discussed managing public perception instead of fixing the problem. As she spoke, her voice steady despite trembling hands, she laid out a timeline that was chilling in its clarity. Contamination began 5 years ago. Complaints were ignored. Tests were altered. And when a local news outlet started asking questions, CleanFlow launched a PR campaign blaming aging pipes and urban myths. The young man played a short audio clip, one of those meetings. A calm, polished voice said, As long as no one connects the dots, we're fine. People forget, or they get tired. The recording ended. No one moved. Then the judge spoke, his voice low but firm. This court is deeply troubled by what it's hearing today. The opposing attorney tried to object, to call the evidence inflammatory, but the judge cut him off. Overruled. The plaintiff has presented credible documented proof of misconduct. If your client has nothing to hide, they should have nothing to fear. The rest of the afternoon unfolded like a dam breaking. One piece of evidence led to another. A former delivery driver admitted under oath that he'd been instructed to dump chemical drums near a storm drain. A lab tech confirmed that positive results were routinely reclassified as inconclusive. Even the company's own safety manual marked for internal use only listed disposal procedures that violated state law. Through it all, the young man remained calm. He asked clear questions. Let the witnesses speak. Never raised his voice. But his presence filled the room, not with noise but with quiet authority. By the time the gavel fell for the day, the gallery was hushed. People didn't clap. They didn't cheer. They just looked at each other with something like awe and relief. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the courthouse steps in gold. The young man stood for a moment, breathing in the cool evening air. He thought about the families who'd waited years for someone to listen. About the sister he'd lost. About the brother who trusted him enough to step into the fire. He hadn't done this for glory. He'd done it because someone had to. And as he walked away, a little girl, maybe 8 or 9, ran up and handed him a folded piece of paper. Before he could say anything, she darted back to her mother and disappeared into the crowd. He opened it later, in the quiet of the apartment. On the paper, in careful handwriting, she'd written, "You made them tell the truth. Thank you." He tucked it into his notebook right next to his sister's old photo. Tomorrow, the final arguments would begin. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, it felt like truth wasn't just possible. It was winning. The morning of the fourth day dawned gray and still, the kind of quiet that feels like the world is holding its breath. Inside the courthouse, the usual hum of clerks and bailiffs was softer, more deliberate. Everyone knew today was different. The case that had started as a routine civil hearing had become something else entirely, a moment where truth, power, and justice were colliding in real time. At the plaintiff's table, the young man in the navy suit sat with his hands folded, eyes closed for just a moment. He wasn't praying exactly, more like centering himself. He'd spent the night reviewing every line of his closing argument, not to memorize it, but to make sure every word carried weight. Because today wasn't just about winning, it was about making sure no one could pretend this never happened. The courtroom filled quickly. Reporters who'd ignored the case at first now jostled for seats in the back. Community members arrived early, some bringing thermoses of coffee, others clutching photos of loved ones affected by the contamination. Even a few city officials showed up, sitting stiffly in the last row, watching with unreadable expressions. Then, just before 9, something unexpected happened. A commotion stirred near the main doors. 2 uniformed officers entered, followed by another man, tall, composed, dressed in a charcoal suit that matched the one at the plaintiff's table down to the button. The room fell silent. People turned. Whispers started. It was his twin. He walked with purpose, not arrogance, flanked by police not as a suspect but as someone under protection. The threat that had forced him into hiding had been neutralized the night before. A tip from an insider led to an arrest, and with it, the lifting of the immediate danger. He'd come straight to court. The judge, already seated, paused mid-sip of water. His eyes flicked between the 2 men, the one at the defense table and the one now standing calmly in the aisle. Identical, unmistakable. The young man at the table stood. "Your Honor," he said, voice steady, "this is my brother, the attorney of record in this case. He's here to confirm the legitimacy of my appearance under emergency authorization." The judge didn't speak right away. He studied them both as if seeing them for the first time. Then he nodded slowly. "Approach the bench. Both of you." They walked forward side by side. No theatrics. No dramatic music. Just 2 brothers, standing shoulder to shoulder in a room that had doubted one of them from the start. At the bench, the brother who'd been in hiding handed over a sealed envelope. "Your Honor, this contains the full documentation from the State Bar, including the emergency proxy approval, affidavits from supervising counsel, and a sworn statement explaining the security threat that necessitated this arrangement." The judge opened it, read silently, then looked up. His expression had changed, not just surprised, but genuinely moved. He glanced at the young man who'd spent 3 days dismantling a corporate cover-up with nothing but facts and quiet resolve. "You've been practicing law under your brother's name?" the judge asked, not unkindly. "No, Your Honor," the young man replied. "I practiced under my own license with temporary authorization to represent this case in his stead, due to extraordinary circumstances. I never claimed to be him. I simply stood in his place, legally and ethically." The judge exhaled, long and slow. He turned to the gallery, then back to the bench. "Court will come to order." He addressed the room, his voice carrying a new weight. "Over the past 3 days, this court has witnessed exceptional legal work grounded in evidence, integrity, and deep respect for the rule of law. I confess, I misjudged counsel at the outset. I allowed assumptions to cloud my judgment. For that, I offer my sincere apology." A murmur ran through the room, not of shock, but of respect. Judges didn't apologize often. When they did, people listened. He turned to the young man. "You didn't just prove your competence. You reminded us all what this system is supposed to be about. Fairness, truth, and giving voice to those who've been silenced." Then he looked at the opposing counsel. "Given the evidence presented and the admissions made by your own witnesses, I find it difficult to see how your client can continue to deny responsibility. This court is prepared to consider sanctions for obstruction, falsification of records, and witness tampering, unless a full and immediate settlement is offered." The opposing attorney paled. He whispered urgently to his client's representative, who looked like they'd just swallowed something bitter, but the young man wasn't focused on them. He was watching the people in the back, the mother who'd lost her garden, the teenager with the skin condition, the retired teacher who'd brought her grandkids' medical bills in a shoebox. Their faces weren't triumphant. They were relieved. Scene. When the lunch recess was called, the brothers stepped outside together for the first time in weeks. They didn't speak at first, just stood on the courthouse steps breathing in the cool air. "You were incredible," the brother said finally. "Better than I would have been." "I had something to prove," the other replied. "Not to them. To us." Back inside, the atmosphere had shifted completely. The opposing side, sensing the tide had turned beyond recovery, requested a private meeting with the judge and plaintiff's counsel. An hour later, they emerged with an offer: full financial restitution for all affected families, independent environmental cleanup funded by the company, and a public admission of wrongdoing, plus a commitment to overhaul their safety protocols under third-party supervision. It wasn't perfect. Justice rarely is, but it was real. When the judge announced the terms to the courtroom, there were no cheers, just quiet tears, held hands, and deep, steadying breaths. People began hugging, not out of celebration, but out of release, like a weight they'd carried for years had finally been lifted. Later that afternoon, as the court wrapped up, the judge asked the young man to remain behind for a moment. "You know," the judge said, once the room had emptied, "I've been on the bench 32 years. I've seen brilliant lawyers, slick lawyers, loud lawyers, but I've rarely seen someone who understood that the law isn't about winning, it's about healing." The young man nodded. "My sister used to say the law should be a mirror, not to show who's right or wrong, but to show who we are and who we could be." The judge looked down at his desk, then back up. "Will you return to practice full-time?" "I think I have to," he said softly. "There are too many voices still waiting to be heard." As he left the courthouse that evening, the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days. On the sidewalk, a group of neighbors waited, not for autographs, but just to say thank you. One elderly man pressed a jar of homemade peach jam into his hands. "From my tree," he said. Still clean, still sweet. The young man accepted it like a sacred gift. That night, back in the apartment above the bookstore, the brothers sat at the same kitchen table where it had all begun. No files this time. Just 2 mugs of tea and the quiet comfort of shared purpose. Outside, the city hummed with ordinary life. Cars passing, laughter from a nearby cafe, the distant chime of a bicycle bell. Nothing grand, nothing cinematic. But in that moment, it felt like everything. Because real change doesn't always come with fireworks. Sometimes it comes quietly, through courage, truth, and 2 brothers who refused to let the world look away. 6 months later, the neighborhood looked different. Not because everything had been fixed overnight, but because hope had taken root. Fresh grass grew where chemical drums once sat buried. New water testing stations stood at street corners, their results posted weekly on bright, easy-to-read signs. Kids played in yards without their parents worrying about the soil. It wasn't perfect, but it was healing. And at the heart of it all was a small legal aid office tucked above a community center. Its windows always open, its door always unlocked. Inside, the young man who'd once walked away from the law now sat across from a single mother, listening as she described how her landlord refused to fix black mold in her apartment. He didn't interrupt, didn't rush her, just took notes, asked gentle questions, and promised to look into her rights under the city's housing code. When she left, he handed her a printed sheet with emergency contacts and a handwritten note. "You're not alone." He wasn't famous. He hadn't given interviews or posted victory speeches online. But word had spread quietly through the community. If you needed help and couldn't afford a lawyer, go see the man in the blue door office. He'd listen. His brother still handled the big cases, the ones that made headlines, that challenged systems from the top down. But this one chose to work from the ground up, because he'd learned something in that courtroom. Justice doesn't always come from gavels and rulings. Sometimes it starts with someone believing you when no one else would. Back at the courthouse, things had changed too. The judge, the same one who'd once scoffed at a young man in a modest suit, now opened every new session with a short reminder. "Appearances tell us nothing about a person's character, competence, or cause. Let us judge arguments, not assumptions." He'd even started a training program for judges and clerks on unconscious bias, developed with input from local community leaders. It wasn't mandatory yet, but attendance had grown steadily. People were listening. One afternoon, the judge stopped by the legal aid office unannounced. He didn't wear his robe, just a simple coat and a paper bag in hand. Inside was a slice of pecan pie from the diner down the street, the kind the young man used to eat during late-night study sessions in law school. "I came to say thank you," the judge said, sitting in the worn visitor's chair. "Not just for the case, but for reminding me why I took this job in the first place." They talked for nearly an hour, about the law, about loss, about how easy it is to forget that behind every file is a human being with a story worth hearing. When the judge left, he paused at the door. "If you ever want to teach a seminar for new attorneys, my courtroom's always open." Meanwhile, the case itself had sparked something bigger. Inspired by the outcome, 3 other communities filed similar lawsuits against polluting companies. Environmental agencies launched statewide audits. Even the state legislature began drafting a bill to protect whistleblowers in public health cases, something that had been stalled for years. None of it happened because of one dramatic moment. It happened because truth, once spoken clearly and backed by evidence, has a way of spreading, like light through a cracked window. On a quiet Saturday morning, the 2 brothers met at their old neighborhood park, the same one where they'd played as kids, where their sister used to chase fireflies in the summer. They sat on a bench near the oak tree she'd loved, sipping coffee from paper cups. "You ever think we'd end up here?" the brother asked. "Not like this," the other replied with a small smile. "I thought I was done with the law for good. But maybe I just needed to remember who it's really for." They didn't talk about fame or legacy. They talked about the teenager whose asthma had improved after the water was cleaned, the retired teacher who'd started a community garden again, the little girl who'd drawn them both thank you cards with crayons. Later that week, the young man received a letter from the State Bar Association. Not a reprimand as some had feared, but an invitation. They wanted him to join a new ethics committee focused on access to justice in underserved areas. He accepted, not for the title, but because it meant more voices might finally be heard. One evening, as he locked up the office, a teenager approached, nervous, shuffling his feet. Are you the lawyer?" he asked. "I try to be," the man said gently. The teen explained that his school was ignoring complaints about racist graffiti in the bathrooms. He'd reported it twice. Nothing happened. "I don't want trouble," he said quickly. I don't feel safe." The man unlocked the office again. "Come on in. Let's figure this out together." That night he stayed late, drafting a formal letter to the school board, citing state anti-discrimination laws and student safety mandates. He didn't do it for credit. He did it because someone had to stand in the gap, and that was the real ending. Not a grand finale, but a quiet beginning. A return to purpose. A choice made every day to show up for people who've been told they don't matter. Back in the courtroom where it all started, the plaque above the bench still read, "Justice is blind." But those who'd been there during those 4 tense days knew better. Justice isn't blind. It's human. It stumbles, it learns, it changes, and sometimes it arrives in the form of a young man in a simple suit, who refused to be dismissed not out of pride, but out of love for the truth. Months turned into a year. The legal aid office grew not in size but in trust. Volunteers came forward. Retired teachers, college students, even a former court clerk who'd been moved by what she'd witnessed. They helped translate forms, organize records, and sit with people who just needed someone to listen. The brothers rarely gave interviews. When asked about the case, they always pointed to the community. "They're the heroes," they'd say. We just handed them the microphone. One spring afternoon, as cherry blossoms drifted down the street, the young man walked past the courthouse. He didn't go inside. He just stood for a moment watching families pass by, kids laughing, neighbors chatting, normal life. Safe life. He thought about his sister, about how she'd believed in fairness even when the world wasn't fair. He hadn't been able to save her, but maybe in some small way he was honoring her by making sure others didn't suffer the same silence. He turned and walked back toward his office, hands in his pockets, the sun warm on his face. There were more cases to take, more voices to lift, more truths to speak, and he was ready, not as a hero, not as a genius in disguise, just as a person who knew that justice doesn't need a spotlight. It just needs someone willing to show up, speak clearly, and never look away.